human history is not just about cruelty. It is also about compassion. It is also about courage, and also it's about kindness.
That's what kept you going. Optimism and belief.
Many of the women who were working in the Maquila Dores, and this is the export zones in
Mexico.
In Mexico at the border, and they were being kidnapped and killed in the most horrible way. So there were many disappearing women.
And why were they kidnapped and killed?
Because there were criminal networks. So it was criminality of the worst kind. And Rwanda had the highest level of women in parliament in the whole world.
Wow.
So this was what the UN can do at its best.
One of the things I've noticed about you is you're a hard negotiator. Even when you're not negotiating, you're a negotiator. But the charm that you have, that includes the smile that you have. But you go in and you disarm the other party because you say it's not just about arguments, winning or losing. It's about doing the right thing.
Well, actually, and this brings us back to, especially now, in the age of AI. What is actually human, right?
Yeah.
Would be the looks, the way the human quality emerges, and that is read. I mean, I grew up at the time when I had to read the silences, what it meant, a particular kind of look, and so on.
Yes.
And that helps.
Yes.
And especially in negotiation, especially when you are in a situation where you have to solve some very difficult issues, the unspoken word is as important. The silences are as important as what people talk about.
And the attentiveness, the eye contact, right? All those things are so important. But as you correctly said, in the age of AI, where we focus very much on technicalities, it becomes a zero sum, not a win-win.
That's why we need to keep our human qualities and also help AI to make us more human.
That's
rather
true.
than the other way around.
That's true.
But it is a struggle.
It is a struggle. And could you share with me one of the toughest negotiations that you've had to do professionally?
Oh dear, there are just so many. There's so many at different times. I think the one, if you think about a conflict situation, I think the most difficult was actually when I had to deal with Afghanistan. And
in what capacity?
In what capacity? I was the executive director of UNIFEM at that time. And I was
UN Development Fund.
This was the United Nations Development Fund for Women. And you know that in Afghanistan, especially after the fall of the Taliban, it was a time of hope for many of the women that their lives could be better.
Yeah.
So many of them, and one of the things that I do is that I listen to the ground. And I listen to what is actually needed by the people at the ground level. So all of them wanted a different life. And the possibility of it. Women wanted an entirely different life. And the possibility was there. It was an opportunity. And I often know in all my negotiations that a window of opportunity is not always open. So you need to capture it and you need to move the agenda forward. So I then wanted to put the issue of women's equal citizenship, on the table, the equality of women for a better life, right? So I, of course, decided that they need to talk about it themselves rather than me, and therefore they should be part of the people participating in the bond process. For that was talking about the peace and also what kind of constitution should come up and so on. And of course, at that time, it was a very difficult period for the SRSG. This is the Secretary General's special representative that was negotiating this, and for the whole UN as well, to get it right. So when I put the issue of gender equality on the table, he was, of course, very upset and said, "Where are you coming from? Are you just listening to the diaspora women? Have you ever even been to Afghanistan? I have to deal with all the clans and trying to find some commonality in such a difficult situation. Do you think that this is the most appropriate time to handle this? Can't this wait?" But I knew that the window of opportunity were close. So he was actually very angry with me. But I didn't give up. And I knew that there was a constituency of support out there as well.
And beyond Afghanistan, right? The people in other parts of the world were also sympathetic to the cause.
Indeed. So he challenged me because he said I didn't know anything about Afghanistan and that I was not capturing the voices of the local women. So, of course, I went to Afghanistan and I had consultations with all the districts and so on, but, of course, supported by the women minister.
Right.
And also, I had a team of people who were able to link me to all kinds of women and so on. At the ground level. And then we decided to take over a burned down cinema that was burned down in Kabul at the time of the Taliban and to bring the local women who wanted change to that cinema on International Women's Day. It was the first International Women's Day at that time, and 1,000 women appeared. And I, of course, introduced them, but they spoke. And, of course, the one thing that they wanted was equal citizenship. And I must say the SRSG was moved because the whole cabinet was there. He was there. Our UN senior Under-Secretary Generals were there. Mary Robinson was there. So they heard the voices of the women themselves.
The big names were all there.
They were all there. Karzai was there, his cabinet, everyone. They were all there, and they heard what was needed. And the one thing that the women wanted for was a different future for their daughters and their sons. They do not want their sons to be fighting in wars after wars and their daughters to be unschooled and to be removed from any possibility of human flourishing. And eventually, it was the SRSG himself who helped me get about 100 women to participate in the Loyal Jilga. This was the general, the Grand Assembly. That created the new constitution. And believe it or not, there was a whole article on equal citizenship rights for women. So what difference did that make, right? Do you know that 3.5 million girls went to primary and secondary school because of that? 100,000 women went into university. But I must say that even with that kind of victory, gains made can be lost. Be lost very, very easily.
When sometimes the characters change.
When the characters change and when actually you negotiate an unjust peace.
Yes.
So what kind of a peace? The UN was not involved with the second part of negotiation. And look at it now. All the gains have been lost. And where are the women and the girls?
I was just watching you. There's so much of fervor. This is not an academic exercise. I mean, what you are sharing happened many years ago. Yet, I can see in your eyes the glistening, the emotions, because you're reliving those moments.
Yes.
Now, I think it's not just about your belief in justice for women, equality for women. I think there's something deeper and endemic in it. You know, I've had occasion to read your book, you know, and it's an extremely moving book. At a human level, I connected with it, you know, and thank you for writing this. Thank you for chronicling this. I would recommend all of you get hold of this book and read it. She's not paying me to say this, by the way. I picked up this. In the book, your memoir, you actually said this, I quote, about your mother. With your permission, I'd like to read this. I watched her weep in loneliness and despair a few days before she was hospitalized. A week later, she died, age 26, having lost the will to live. And I lost my mother a few years ago. And I can only imagine how it felt for you. You were barely 6 years old. You also talked about how you experienced the desperation of poverty. I don't think you were seeking sympathy. You were sharing at a human level, and thank you. I think that experience and seeing your mother go through what she did has cast a die in you. Everything that happened to you after that had to do with that experience. Because you could understand the human emotions behind these decisions, behind the toughness of life. Am I correct?
You put your finger on it.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure when, but I think there was a time when I decided that what my life purpose happens to be, or what I thought it was to change the trajectory of vulnerability for as many people as I can. And that was what moves me and keeps me alive. So it's not intellectual. I became I went to university, did my PhD and all that, so that I could actually understand deeper and also articulate it in a way that different audiences can understand.
And also credibility.
And absolutely.
Let's face it, credentials matter.
Yeah.
If you're not successful and you don't have the credentials, you can say the same thing, but nobody's going to listen.
Exactly. And also it gives you a different environment, and also to understand that human history is not just about cruelty. It is also about compassion. It is also about courage, and also it's about kindness. And how on earth do you play that dynamics out in a world that is not always human friendly?
And I guess it's a question of whether you want to see the bottle as half full or empty. And you've chosen to see the bottle as half full, be an optimist, even in the most dire circumstances. And I think that's what kept you going. Optimism and belief, but not in a naive way. Optimism, and I respect that. But you also gave credit to your Catholic education and a Catholic upbringing. Would you want to share a little bit more about why that was so important for you?
But first, to go back to your first point, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I am an optimist. And in fact, I would say I am an idealist as well. But I am an idealist without illusions.
Without delusions.
Illusions.
Okay.
In other words, that I'm a realist as well.
Yeah.
Because I have lived through the reality of poverty and suffering, and I saw it in other people, but I've also seen the agency of people, right? And that...
Like in Afghanistan.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And throughout the world, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you go to the ground and you try to understand context and so on. Well, when it comes to faith, then obviously I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's also very personal. But I honestly believe that I'm not alone in the world. And I remembered, because when I was young, I read the story of Michelangelo and the wonderful painting, that he and I love the point when God and man touched together, right?
Powerful.
It was extremely powerful. And when he opened that painting and he showed it to the Pope looked up and said, "Thank God we're not alone."
Wow. I mean, that's why I feel that sometimes we make it too clinical by taking some of these subjective emotions out of the equation, because they're part of being human. And sometimes we want to have discussions platonic without, we say we can't bring religion into it. But sometimes you have to bring religion into it, as long as it doesn't get into another person's space, private space, right? You were a convent girl, and you have written quite a bit about how much being in Katong Convent, being a convent girl shaped you, your beliefs, and also your sense of humor.
Yes.
Would you want to share a little bit about that?
But coming back to kind of religion, I think it's not so much just the institutionalized kind of religion, because then you get into all kinds of stuff. There have been the kind of religious wars and so on, right? And who's right and who's wrong and all that. And I can't stand that.
Yeah.
I honestly believe in the spirit, right? That
spirituality.
In spirituality, but also the human capacity to be more than ourselves.
Yes.
So in other words, our human potential to be more human than what we think we have become because of the environment. So just stop there. But the other thing you asked me about Katong Convent, it was a fun school. when I think of it, I laugh and I smile because I'm not going to go to many of the stories. But
Why not? Why not?
No.
How naughty were you as a schoolgirl?
No, the thing was that there was a community of fun girls, right? I mean, I was in the A class, right? And the girls, but it was very sad because I don't think we should be classifying people like that anymore. And hopefully the educational system doesn't do that. But there was A, B, C, and D. And I used to look at the D class girls and I just envy them because there was Marie Bong was teaching
Marie
them.
Bong,
they were teaching them,
principal.
all the different poetry and the art and the literature. And there I was stuck with science, maths, A maths, or physics, everything, right? But anyway, to be very honest, I'm glad that I had a very strong science and mathematical training because later on, when I shifted to social sciences, I still had that hardcore discipline.
Foundation. Yeah. This may sound cliched, but this question I'm going to ask you anyway. In the midst of all this, how did you cope as a mother of two girls, twins? How did you cope? I mean, today this is brought up by a lot of younger women to say, it's too much of stress. Because the burden of raising the child invariably falls on the mother in the early years at least. So you were traveling like crazy all over the world. You were in New York, you would go down to Afghanistan on the ground. Next day you were in Africa. So how did you manage that? And your daughters seem to have grown up to be fabulous young women. How did you manage that?
To be very honest, I'm extremely proud of my children, right? Yeah, and I'm not going to just take all the credit for myself. I think they too played a part, and it helps. I think it was such a gift to have twins, so that they also interacted with each other,
right?
And they found build very close kind of human relationships and so on. But to be very honest, I think I became the mother that I wanted to have, right? Which is and also because I had such a difficult childhood, I used their childhood also to think of what childhood can become. So they became they
became like your mother.
No. They became my playmates. So what they said to me was that they actually fell. I mean, of course, they knew I had the final authority and all that, but they were very comfortable, with me. And then also I did ask them. I said, when I travel and so on, do you miss me? Of course, we miss you, Mom. But at the same time, we have each other. Right? And and I do have eventually when I went back when I went back to my extended family and all that, I made sure that they were all part of the community. So it's not. I wouldn't say it was easy. Because I used to drive them to school, even in Bangkok when I was working there. In the middle of the floods, I'd be driving the car through the flood waters and all that.
Were they with you there?
They were with me everywhere.
Everywhere, okay. In all your major postings?
All.
Okay.
But the other thing that I did was that I wanted them to also experience the world that I was trying to contribute to. So when
You've obviously done a good job because they all seem to be following after your kind of work.
In different ways.
In different ways.
The elder twin is basically, in policy analysis, humanitarian work, and so on, and very good at it. My other daughter is just a fantastic writer. She's just published a novel, a Penguin just published many of her translations. She translates from German into Malay, Malay into English.
Wow.
So so it's very, very well known in Kuala Lumpur and internationally. So both of them are. I have to leave them alone now. They are their own person. But to be very honest, I brought them on many trips. I brought them, when I went to Africa, they were with me. When I went to Bosnia, they were with me. So everywhere, right? So they knew difficulties that other people were experiencing, but also the joy of interaction and also the acceptance of diversity in our world today.
Right. Listening to what you are saying makes me want to be a mother as well.
I had fun being a mother, and
really,
I still
that's
am.
The way it should be. And it reminds me of the relationship I see between my wife and my daughter. Yeah. They're like buddies, friends. Now, to shift gears, you have spent most, if not all your life all your work in the UN in the space of empowering women.
First of all, I must thank the UN for giving me the opportunities that I had. It was just unbelievable. The tease by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, when he appointed me as Under Secretary General, he said to me, "You have served half the world's population, women. Mm-hmm. Now I'm sending you to the other half. You go to Asia and try to solve the financial crisis that has just emerged." He took me out of UNIFEM because it was becoming UN Women. Mm-hmm. But he wanted me to go somewhere where I could use the skills that I had developed. So he sent me to Asia Pacific, that in terms of population was also half the world's population.
That's right.
In UNIFEM, let me just say what I was working on. I was working on the issue of women's economic security and rights, ending violence against women, peace and security, and also the issue of governance as well. What kind of governance would actually help the people at the ground level that can uplift lives, right?
Right.
So that. And why it's important to get women's voices and women's leadership into the governance space. Otherwise, many of the issues wouldn't even emerge as critical. Like, for example, the issue of care. We're just talking about care. And care, to me, at that time, was not just a value, or neither was it just a sector, because you talk about the care sector and then women having, care work being recognized and all that. For me, I saw it as very much a very important foundation for how our society will have to function in order to build the social fabric. We can only weave the social fabric of our society through enduring value of care.
There were two things that struck me about how a framework of sorts has helped provide that justice and that care that you're talking about. The first thing is in 1995, how you were very involved in organizing the Beijing Conference, and that had powerful symbolic messaging to the world, because it was a global conference on women, and I think nothing as powerful as the Beijing Conference. And perhaps you could share a little bit more about why that was so significant. And that leads to the 2000 landmark UN Security Council Resolution 1325, that was designed to change the world. And it did for some time. And unfortunately, I think it is reverted in many other places in the world.
Well, for the case of the Fourth World Conference on Women, obviously I was the executive director of UNIFEM, the Women's Fund, so I obviously had a very big role there. But even before going to UNIFEM, the reason why I was, in a way, pulled in was because of the work that I was doing before.
Yes.
And when it was the Third World Conference on Women, I was in ESCAP at that time.
ESCAP.
And
ESCAP stands for?
The Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Right. So they normally would do the preparatory work. And this was done for the Third World Conference on Women that was held in Nairobi, right? So after when I saw what was happening, and wasn't just me, there were many other women leaders who saw that somehow it was like disconnected from real ground people's lives at the ground level. So we knew that in 10 years from the Third World Conference to the fourth, we had 10 years. We need to do something very different. So there was a tremendous opportunity to mobilize the ground. And I think the transnational networks, because all of us had a consciousness that what happened at the Third World Conference was not enough to bring about the social transformation that we all wanted to see, and that we had to work the ground. And we managed. So I started with Asia Pacific, but was able to link up with Africa, with Latin America, with Europe, and we got funding to kind of do that. So it was because of that work. And also getting the right voices and the right issues onto the agenda. That was why I was brought to a UNIFEM to now make sure that what was on the ground would now be, so the framework at that time was the local is global and the global local. So if you want change, really very deep change, and to amplify it at the global level, then the UN is the best possible place to kind of do that, because it's a universal organization with the authority of convening and also, the authority to develop frameworks and so on. I thought that some of the stories that I heard from the ground can be told in symbols. So there were two big symbols that was used at the Fourth World Conference on Women. Do you know that the women, especially at the ground level of Asia Pacific, decided to weave small cloths? And it was huge. It became such a big cloth. Each one of them, they got their weavers from the rural areas to weave little bits and pieces, and they then put them all together. And the first thing we did as a symbol was they marched up to the Great Wall of China and put that cloth that we weaved round the whole the wall, not the whole thing, but whatever they could do.
But it was huge.
Yes, it was huge. It was big. But what was the message? Was that if you really want to live, because the theme of the conference was equality, development, and peace, right? If you really want sustainable peace, then you have to weave your social fabric in such a way that there is equality and there is inclusive development for sustainable peace. And if you have sustainable peace, you don't have to have your walls. And that was a key message.
In the Beijing Conference.
By the
people on the ground.
The people from the ground.
Yeah. So it's a powerful tapestry.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And then later on, when I became the head of UNIFEM, I asked my team, what is a symbol that you would like to bring to the Fourth World Conference on women? And the African women, because they just went through the genocide in Rwanda. But at the same time, there was a tremendous hope because the end of apartheid.
Yeah. Oh, right? Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And Nelson Mandela was the best symbol of the icon of peace, right? So they said, can we bring a peace torch to Beijing? And then I thought, you know what? It's such an inspiration.
Yes.
The way Nelson Mandela did it was so inspirational.
And about forgiveness as well.
Amazing. So then my team, amazing team. I had an amazing team. Or else none of this work is done alone, right? If you don't have a team and you can't spark ideas, it's not going to work. So my team said, can we build the peace torch very differently? It's going to be a kind of an Olympic torch, but we want it to be done with the recycled tins from the villages of Africa and so on. So they did that, and it was an amazing torch. Then I thought, you know what? Let's make it something even more special. So why don't we light this torch in South Africa in the place of the worst conflict at that time,
apartheid.
KwaZulu-Natal. And we lit that torch at the break of dawn in KwaZulu-Natal. There were, of course, South African leaders there, and the community was there. We did it in the marketplace. And do you know, when we lit the torch, a flock of doves just flew in over the market. I mean, I was so touched. It was just unbelievable. Then we got the youth from South Africa, some of the schools, girls, to run that torch to Johannesburg. And then from there, it was passed from conflict-affected countries to conflict-affected countries.
The road.
Along the road, but of course they stopped, rested, and this
but
and that.
It was all on the road.
Yeah. But of course they took the train to get across the border. But there was,
what powerful symbolism.
And that wasn't it. So by the time it was true, right, the torch went to Beijing, and it lit up the 4th World Conference on Women.
It's almost like the Olympic torch.
And it was covered front page of the New York Times.
Fantastic.
And we went to the song of Keep On Moving Forward, Never Looking Back.
How important a turning point was that?
I think for my team and for people were crying when that happened, right? And I think, sometimes if we just stick to not that I'm undermining it, okay, but intellectual analysis and all that. I think you need to get into the human soul, right? Right?
Yeah.
And you really need to maybe do things differently, that tells different stories, but that resonates with images and and something that people can resonate with. And in the process, you get transformed as well.
And I can relate to that, because I think there's a place for rational intellectual arguments and discourse. But I think over time we have forgotten the other dimension. The pure human dimension. What you are relating to us about. There was so much of excitement and emotions as you were reliving that, and it's not about you. It's not about you. No. It's about what happens when you have a cascading effect of all these human souls and spirits with lived experiences, which to a large extent are negative, coming together. And for me, the word is hope. It actually gave them hope.
Yes.
Whether it translates to something positive or not is regardless. The point is they needed that hope.
Yes.
To know that they're not alone. And that brings me to the 2000 UN Security Council Resolution 1325. In the interest of time, if you could just in a nutshell tell us why that resolution was so critical at that point in time. And that was 5 years after Beijing.
Indeed.
What is it that transpired that made you feel the critical importance of sponsoring something like that? And what was the reception that resolution actually got from the bulk of men in that chamber?
Well, to be very honest, I mean, that's one side of me. I mean, the other side of me, that's why I train academically, is also to be very technical, right?
Yeah.
You have to be. I mean, in the bureaucracy, you need to be political. I mean, first of all, I feel that you have to be a problem solver, and you have to be locally grounded, but you also have to be politically smart.
Yes.
And you have to be able to change your language. Right? So that I can't go there to the Security Council and say all the things I'm sharing with you now.
Yeah.
I have to be very, very clear what the evidence base is, what is happening.
And very categorical.
But also you have to do very good analysis.
Absolutely.
I mean, even to influence, some of the work was taken up even by the World Bank, by the Monetary Fund, even this whole thing about women's work and smart economics and all that was done through very, very intellectual analysis. Right?
And rigorous.
And very rigorous. So it's not like you just have one way of communicating. I think we have to find different...
And cannot just be about tree hugging.
No. You have to be able to know when it's appropriate to do what. right? And then what kind of language. So I think I become like a translator, right, from one language to another, in order to have the power to move a certain situation at certain times. Okay, so coming back. So, of course, I went to so many of the conflict zones after Beijing and so on, to Rwanda, to Bosnia, and so on. And everyone just felt that the way we understand the work of Security Council, but the work of Security Council is to ensure that they were determined not to, the future generation will not experience war, right? But then the whole thing, unfortunately, when they think of security, has always been military security, right? Not that that is not important.
That is important.
Yeah, but at the same time, if we look at what was happening, or at least I did analysis, and this is where the intellectual work comes in. If you do the analysis of the cases that went into Security Council discussion, and many of them reoccurred over and over again. And why? Because they went for ceasefire. And ceasefires and also certain even peace agreements was actually a space in between wars. They kept repeating itself. And so many of the women were, because they suffered the most, right?
Yes.
In terms of the genocide, they was on women's bodies and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into that detail. But there was again a groundswell that we need to do something, not just in the General Assembly, because the Beijing Conference and what came out of it was a UN General Assembly framework, right? But,
sorry, a quick question. Why was the analysis that women were the victims, the primary victims? I'm trying to understand that.
Okay, but it wasn't only the primary victims, because at that time, if you look at what happened, the use of sexual violence in order to, and also the whole issue of women's reproductive capacity. If you want to create genocide, just attack women's reproductive capacity and destroy the children, right? Right? And so we had to deal with that.
And to wipe out that entire
The best way is to kill those who can reproduce life. Right. So of course there were horrible stories. So some of it is
no, but I do would like you to share, because I think it's very important. You in your book you highlighted three places that you visited that shocked you. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it right. Ciudad Juarez in Mexico in 2002. Yes. Arusha in Tanzania. Srebrenica in Bosnia. What was it about these tragedies that you witnessed that gave you the sense of urgency to do something?
Okay, in the Arusha's case, I went to the courts, right, that were listening to the genocide, and I was actually very upset that many of the stories that the women took time to tell their stories, and until we had the woman president Navi Pillay of the Rwanda tribunal, she understood this immediately and made the sexual violence a crime against humanity, because it was
So it wasn't codified
at that time. No. Until then, it wasn't. Right.
Okay.
And, it was like part of
conflict. Rape wasn't classified.
That was not seen as a crime against humanity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was only after we had that organization, the organizing on the ground, that she actually was able to even come up with a first conviction on that. Right.
This was in Tanzania.
The
Rwanda crisis.
The genocide took place in Rwanda.
In Tanzania.
No, in Rwanda. But the tribunal, the Arusha tribunal,
was in Tanzania.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about the Mexico?
Okay.
What?
Okay, student warriors, and that it was entirely different. But let's finish because that. But I can touch that.
Just touch on it so that my viewers will understand the gravity of the situation then. What was the world like for women?
Oh my goodness. It was extremely painful because many of the women who were working in the Maquila Dores, and this is the export zones in
Mexico.
In Mexico at the border, and they were being kidnapped and killed in the most horrible way. So there were many disappearing women.
And why were they kidnapped and killed?
Because there were criminal networks. So it was criminality of the worst kind, right? And at that time, President Fox was in charge of Mexico. So his wife invited me to visit Ciudad Juarez to meet with the mothers of the missing women, right? And also to see whether I could really get a sense of what on earth is there that I could help to at least recommend to them. And they didn't trust any of the guards that the local government was
the security officers.
Wanted. So they gave me the presidential guards. So I went with the presidential guards to Ciudad Juarez, and then I was put up in this hotel. And then somebody said, this may even belong to a criminal network. So make sure your room's door is locked and this and that. But anyway, the point is I was very well guarded. Okay? So all this thing, I do get protection. Huh? So anyway, so I went there, and then the book tells you what I did there. But I just wanted to say, let's get back now to the 1325 because that is very important. But what was very clear when I was working on the ground was that it was not that women are just victims. They also had an amazing urgency to recreate something new, okay? Because they were fed up of unsustainable peace.
Right.
And therefore, they were community peace builders. And I'll come back to one story that I think is very important. But they were able to be weavers of the new social fabric and so on, right? So basically, and again, all this work is not just mine. Okay, we had networks of people helping and going back and forth and so on. But I was very pleased that they asked me to lead in the UN to try to shepherd the whole thing, to shepherd it into the Security Council, work with the member states that I knew how to, and then to make sure that the Security Council would actually give us a resolution. Because normally, firstly, you have to understand that in the Security Council and the UNGA, they work in silos. So
one was Security Council, which is smaller and tighter, and the other one is the General Assembly.
Yes, but beyond that, certain issues, especially gender equality issues, goes to the General Assembly. They don't go to the Security Council. And I was moving this,
which was focused primarily on military,
on basically security and basically on conflicts that involve states and so on. And very it was a very male-guarded bastion.
Correct.
So here there we were with all these women coming in and saying, we want you to address this. But luckily, Namibia, who experienced this and was also part of the process of the ground, and also Nelson Mandela, because he was actually the facilitator of the Burundi peace process, and he brought UNIFEM in. So we had a lot of, so it was an African's agenda.
Yeah.
So when Namibia became the president of the Security Council, they kind of asked me, I and my team, to be the advisor. Okay, so already it was a way in, and then we worked the Security Council and so on. So anyway, so we brought the issue in, and in what way was it different? We basically said, firstly, what we are about is that we want sustainable peace and security. And it's not because it is a women's issues, but women know how to do it from the ground because they have been, they have to deal with care and taking care and rebuilding families and their communities and all that. When you all are the architects of war. Okay, yeah. So basically, we want sustainable peace so that life can actually go on. So anyway, I said the focus here is on not just military security, but military security, fine, but you need to look at human security, but also you need to look at the root causes of conflict. And you're not looking at that. And the root causes of conflict cannot be seen in silos. You cannot be seen that pushed it to the UN General Assembly and then you just deal with a certain set of issues. It has to be holistic. You have to look into the kind of development, the kind of governance, the kind of human rights abuses. You need to look at how inclusive your social fabric is, and so on and so forth, right?
If you could tell us, how was it received by the members of the UN Security Council?
Yeah,
and before it was passed.
Yes. So basically, there was a lot of negotiation. They said, this is the first time we're hearing it. Okay, we will take it in, but let's just come up with a presidential statement, which is what they would normally do. But we said, no, we want a resolution. And then this is the framework of the resolution. First, we're looking at prevention. We're looking at protection. We're looking at participation. How can you participate and build community networks of peace builders, because it's not just at the top. All right? Yeah. And how do you rebuild? How do you rebuild in such a way that it is sustainable, we rebuild for sustainable peace? And I must say that Rwanda was a very good case. You know, when I went to Rwanda, it was just after the genocide, right? And there was an area that people from my team and the UN didn't want me to go, but I went, okay? And this was a place where the women were infected with HIV/AIDS, both sides, right? Hutu and the Tutsi and so on. And when I went there, I stayed there for hours listening to their stories. And I saw them weaving baskets. Right? And then when I listened, of course they were crying and all that, and I was also crying, you know. And then there were children running around, and they said, "These are." I said, "Whose children are these?" And then they said the word, "These children of Rwanda." Okay, both sides, right? So I just then said, "Okay, the baskets
that's your shared interest."
Yeah, but so I said, "Okay." Now, your baskets, where they weave these for the food grains and all that, I said, I'm going to call them the peace baskets, and I'm going to actually get the private sector to sell them. And I managed to actually go back to New York, get the private sector. So I had people from Macy's and Bloomingdale's. The head was very involved, and I got the business women in New York to help me, and it was amazing. But I also said that because you were collecting food grains with these baskets, the peace basket will also be part of building back the country, and the way we're going to do it is that we're going to get a lot of women into parliament and to ask for land rights and the rebuilding. And they become part of the rebuilding of the country.
So the baskets were a symbol for that.
Well, it was a symbol, and then. And it was such a success. So I won't tell you how successful it was. But recently I was in Hainan, and the ambassador of Rwanda was at the same meeting with me, and he was just sitting opposite me at lunch. And then I told him my experience of Rwanda, and I reflected on it. And he said, so you are the one, he said to me. He said, do you know the peace basket is at the center of a national emblem? And Rwanda had the highest level of women in parliament in the whole world.
Wow.
So this was what the UN can do at its best.
And when you were telling me there were a lot of emotions and applause immediately after it was passed.
Yes, indeed. Actually, it was quite something. But everybody felt that they owned it, right? So the thing was that when it was passed, there were a lot of the leaders and the ground.
And mostly men.
And the men were all that. In fact, we got a lot of support from the men who wanted peace. Right? They also saw that who had the guts to go and do and develop all this framework and be so sure that and to make sure that it was unanimously passed. There was not even any extension.
And it was unanimous.
It was unanimous.
Yeah.
But the point was that it was the loudest clap ever heard anywhere, and it was in the Security Council that never usually clap.
Yeah, because most of the resolutions are military in nature. Right?
But also very,
very formal.
Yeah.
And just for the sake of my viewers, this is what was the key aspect of the Security Council Resolution 1325. That the UN explicitly recognizes the disproportionate impact of armed conflict on women and girls, mandates their equal participation in peace building and conflict resolution, and calls for protection against wartime sexual violence. Very powerful, succinct and powerful. The sad part is, at least my observation is, it's been 26 years since.
But it has made a huge difference.
A huge difference. But are we at a point where, given all that's happening in the world, this has been put on the back burners, and are we losing the momentum that was gained in all these years? And how do you feel about that? I mean, so much of work went into this landmark thing. It's not just symbolic. It made a huge difference from what you shared about Rwanda, the highest number of women in parliament and so on. But all that is going to be drowned. This is the way I see it. It's going to be drowned out by larger military campaigns in Ukraine, in Iran, and everywhere else. And people all over the world are disillusioned and asking and putting the blame on UN and say, what the hell are you all doing?
Indeed.
How do you feel?
Yeah. All right. So I am, of course, very heartbroken.
We've got about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Very heartbroken that the rule of law had been broken, and not just the rule of law, but the rule of war. Had been terribly broken, and that what we have is actually a strongman complex. That to go back to the use of force and coercion and so on, right? To basically deal with conflicts. And the whole idea of the UN and the UN Charter was to look at cooperation and also to make the world safe for diversity.
Yes.
Right? And it was a protective framework for human security in so many ways, and it succeeded. It succeeded for 81 years.
Yes.
So, and the League of Nations just succeeded for not fully, but for 20 years. And the Second World War happened. We haven't had a Third World War.
Yeah.
So the UN has endured, but the world has changed. The leadership by the US that was so important to really the multilateral world order has pulled out. And has weakened the whole multilateral system. So what next? I honestly feel I'm not one to lose hope, but I honestly feel that the countries and the people who have actually benefited from that multilateral world order should use this not just as to see all the negative things, but as an opportunity to rethink what multilateralism in the new context must mean without necessarily the US. Right, and it has an opportunity. We have the opportunity to look at how to build a new foundation that looks at equity, because that is very important. To look very much at our social fabric, at our ecology, and also making sure that we have the right foundation to prevent the whole prevention agenda and to go into negotiation and mediation before it becomes conflicts that we cannot solve. But worse still, I think we need to also be aware that we are in a very disruptive and dangerous world where there is the militarization of technology. As we have seen, there is a broken of sovereignty, a respect for sovereignty, and that even in the middle of mediation, some interested state will be able to just come in
And disrupted.
And disrupted. So
Yeah.
we're living in a very, very disruptive world. But I honestly feel that we have to understand that the multilateral system, as represented by the UN, may be weakened. But we have to understand the UN consists of, it's actually not one UN, there are 3 UN. So one is the member states, a very state-centric, top-down organization of member states, and the powerful always do what they like.
Right.
And then the rest of us, the small countries, have to struggle and so on. But we have had 81 good years, or else Asia would not have been able to turn around the poverty and flourish the way we have. So we have our member states, we have the UN bureaucracy and all the institutions, but we also have we the peoples. And it's time for we the peoples to start thinking about the kind of world that we want.
Excellent point. Where we take ownership and agency to do that. You've said so much with such passion. A passion that can be there only because of your lived experience and what you've witnessed over decades. It's amazing that you have not given up hope. Most people would have by now, and I respect you for that. My question is, in a nutshell, what have you learned about yourself as a human being, as a person? What have you learned about yourself in all these years?
Well, I would say that not so much about myself, because I don't do too much of an analysis, but what is it that the world needs that we can contribute to, including me, right? I think there are 2 things. One is that we have to really look at the stewardship for a human future. We are stewards. We are here in the world to be stewards. So each in our different way, we have to still be able to find ways of contributing. And the other thing is that we genuinely have to close the power-wisdom gap and have greater moral clarity of what it means to be human in this very disruptive world.
Thank you very much, Noeleen.
Thank you.